So good evening, everybody. I think we're about to get started. If everyone's had a chance to grab some snacks, feel free to take as much as you can. There's always leftover, so please help yourself. Cheese and crackers are always a good thing at a 4 o'clock talk on a Monday afternoon. My name is Jason Kahns. I am a member of the anthropology department here at UT, and thank you all for being here tonight. So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we'd like to acknowledge the Alabama Coshada, Caddo, Carrizo, Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or who have become a part of the lands and territories in Texas. So this talk is part of a colloquium being held this semester here at the Rapoport Center titled Cultures of Environmental Justice. The colloquium is meant to engage the different ways that environmental justice is understood, experienced, and lived in diverse contexts, and to open questions about the complex relationships between detection, action, and repair that thinking through and with environmental justice movements often demands. So our next event, which I invite all of you to attend, will be on March 27th. Next Monday. It will not be here in this room, so it's going to be a little bit different than usual, but rather in the LBJ School for Public Affairs, and specifically in Sid Richardson Hall 3.122, if you want to write that down or check that out on the website, and will not take place at our usual time of 4 to 6, but will rather be from 5 to 7. It's going to be a roundtable discussion on food and justice amidst multiple crises featuring Dr. Raj Patel and Dr. Aaron Wentz of the LBJ School, Dr. Alex Rasilis of UTRGV, Carolina Mueller of the National Young Farmers Coalition, and Doris Brown and Ben Hirsch of Westside Recovery in Houston. You're all invited to attend. I think it's going to be a really fantastic discussion. I'd like to also thank the Rapoport Center and especially its directors, Karen Engel and Neville Hode, for making this series possible, and the series co-sponsors, including Planet Texas 2050, the LBJ School of Public Affairs, the South Asia Institute, Native American and Indigenous Studies, the Teresa Lozano Long Institute for Latin American Studies, and the Departments of Geography, Anthropology, and City and Regional Planning. I'd like to particularly thank Native American and Indigenous Studies and the Departments of Geography and City and Regional Planning for their generous support of tonight's talk. So we are privileged tonight to be joined by Dr. Heather Dorries. Dr. Dorries is an assistant professor jointly appointed to the Department of Geography and Planning and the Center for Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on the relationships between urban planning and settler colonialism and examines how Indigenous intellectual traditions, including Indigenous environmental knowledge, legal orders, and cultural production, can serve as the foundation for justice-oriented approaches to planning. She's currently revising her book manuscript, Planning the End of the World, Indigenous Planning Theory and the Art of Refusal, of which tonight's talk may be a part, which demonstrates how Indigenous knowledge systems can inform resurgent forms of planning and urbanism. She also is co-editor of the collection Settler City Limits, Indigenous Resurgence and Settler Colonial Violence in the Urban Prairie West, which was published by University of Manitoba Press in 2019. Following Dr. Dorries' talk, Dr. Miriam Solis will offer a brief response. Dr. Solis is an assistant professor of community and regional planning here at UT Austin. Her research draws on environmental justice theory and research to examine the role of environmental education and workforce development in planning, design, and operation of urban infrastructures. She is a community-based participatory researcher who frequently collaborates with nonprofit organizations and government agencies. Dr. Solis is on the leadership team for Planet Texas 2050, a faculty fellow at the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis, a faculty affiliate of the Teresa Lozano Long Institute for Latin American Studies, and a board member of the Center for American Architecture and Design. So we're in for an exciting discussion this evening, I think, and probably also a lively discussion. So without further ado, I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Dr. Dorries here to the Rapoport Center.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks for having me here. It's It's been really, I've had a great day. I've met a lot of students and faculty and had some really great conversations and some great food as well. So I'm having a really great time here. So I'm also, in addition to all the things that Jason mentioned, I'm also an Anishinaabe person and a member of Saugeen First Nation and Treaty 1 territory, also known as Winnipeg. And I guess as an Indigenous person, as someone who's trained in planning, my research has always been occupied with one core contradiction, right, that I see happening in planning. I think on the one hand, one of the most pervasive beliefs about planning is that planning is about creating the conditions for living well, that it contributes to our quality of life. And if you look at the mission statement for most professional planning bodies, and here I've got the statement from the APA, and the Canadian statement looks quite similar. It talks about all of these things. It talks about planning being about making cities for people, about creating the economic, social, and ecological conditions for growth and development in ways that will benefit the public. And the public is a word that we hear discussed a lot in planning. And I think it's these things that drew me to planning and probably drew a lot of other people to the field of planning. And on the other hand, in the context of settler colonialism, one of the things that I found in my research is that planning is also a project about death. Settler colonialism requires not only the dispossession, but the death of Indigenous and racialized people. And one of the things that planning does, in addition to, or while trying to accomplish all of these goals, is that it aids in the establishment and management of a racial regime of property, and in so doing, aids in the colonial acquisition of territory, while also participating in the criminalization of Indigenous resistance. So planning ends up advancing and reflecting the necropolitical structure of settler colonialism. And in planning for this public that planners love to talk about, planning is also calling this public into being through processes that determine who matters and who does not. And so planning spatializes racial regimes of property that are part of the legal framework upon which planning relies and which assign value to human life according to a racial hierarchy. And I think this racial hierarchy is well apparent in cities and results in the underdevelopment of racialized neighborhoods, the underfunding and defunding of housing, transportation, recreation facilities, and a variety of other services typically within the domain of planning. And so consequently, cities not only fail to provide, but also withhold the requirements of life from the most vulnerable people. And so in this way, through its implication in settler colonialism, planning is one of the forces that participates in the targeted death of urban places and urban life, a process that Catherine McKittrick calls urbicide, or the deliberate death of the city and willful place annihilation. Reflecting on the multiple forms of urban displacement and dispossession that target racialized people, geographer Mia Dawson observes that planning and policy produce the routinization of death that reiterates a racial geography of entrenched segregation and enclosure of wealth. So what I want to do today in this paper is to concretize some of these contradictions by examining park management in Toronto. And I'm going to focus on the ways that the city of Toronto has violently cleared parks of homeless encampments while also making park management part of the City of Toronto's Reconciliation Action Plan. I will examine how these policies relating to park management in Toronto reflect an extractive and managerial approach to park spaces based on an understanding as parks as a form of property. And then I will also consider how Indigenous legal orders can help us to reframe understandings of human and environment relations that emphasize relationality rather than exclusion. So I have some pictures here. A lot of the pictures that I've taken, I took myself, unless I've indicated who took the picture. And if you had walked into a park in Toronto on March 25th, 2020, you would have encountered a sign like this one on the left, and it reads, COVID-19 warning. Emergency physical distancing bylaw for all City of Toronto parks and public squares. To help stop the spread of COVID-19, do not remain for longer than a brief moment closer than 2 meters to any other person who is not a member of the same household. And this was because on March 25th, 2020, the City of Toronto announced that it was closing all parks and related amenities in order to stop the spread of COVID-19. And violators were threatened with fines of up to $5,000. And these fines were enforced by police officers, who you see there on the right, who were deployed to protect Toronto parks. This led to great public outcry. Toronto is a dense city. It's also a city with a lot of parks, and people saw parks as one of the few places where they could go to escape their homes during the lockdown. So there was demands for access to these recreation facilities, and the city eventually reopened the parks a few months later on May 20th. Although playgrounds and exercise equipment remained closed, and sadly the city even put up chains across basketball nets to prevent any kids from having illicit games of basketball. And so I highlight this not because, I'm wishing to challenge the seriousness of the pandemic or attempts to address an unprecedented health emergency, but I want to draw your attention to how deeply regulated parks can be. They're subject to a variety of urban norms and laws that criminalize specific park users and users. And we know parks are important, or I think that's a commonly shared assumption. Parks also serve many functions. They enhance urban ecosystems, they provide social and psychological benefits to urban dwellers, and many of these regulations are designed to protect these health and social benefits. However, they often do so at the cost of further marginalizing some of the most vulnerable members of society. And in Toronto, and I think this is probably the case in many other cities, perhaps it's the case here, since COVID-19, debates about who parks are for and how they should be protected have become even more acute. And people who turn to parks as a space to sleep or stay as a last resort have been banished from parks, and their use of these park spaces has been criminalized. And this is in part due to a housing crisis, or what we might want to think of several crises that are producing an acute need for housing. And Toronto, like many other cities, has been dealing with a housing affordability crisis for a very long time. And it's a crisis that has become more significant over the past few years. Toronto recently surpassed Vancouver as the most expensive city in Canada. I think it's one of the most expensive cities in North America. Residents typically spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing, and increasing numbers of people are being priced out of the housing market altogether. There are a lot of people leaving Toronto for smaller cities. And for those who can't leave, the number of people who are experiencing houselessness is growing. And I think there are many reasons for this growing housing crises, or many crises contributing to this housing crisis. Among them, the federal government has divested from affordable housing programs in the 1990s, followed by the provincial and municipal governments divesting from housing provision, which means that almost no new affordable housing has been built in Canada over the past 30 years. The growing financialization of the rental market means that rental housing quantity and quality is falling along at the same time that rents are increasing. Wages are stagnant. legal protections for tenants are being eroded, and demand for rental housing is growing. I don't think any of these things are unique to Toronto. I have this graph that shows you roughly where Toronto sits when it comes to the number of unsheltered residents per 10,000 residents. And it might seem like Canadian cities are in good shape, but I don't think there's anything that keeps this problem from growing. You know, when we look at the ways that wage supports or protections for tenants are being eroded, there's no reason why Toronto might look like Washington or any other city in a few years. People often think, Canada is this nice liberal playground where there's no problems, but I think maybe we're just working with some different timelines. So the causes that contribute to this housing crisis reflect a logic of neoliberal governance and revanchist urbanism that is designed to promote the transfer of wealth to those who already have the most wealth through the management of private property and the weakening of rights to housing and self-determination for the most vulnerable. So I want to talk now a little bit about property, because I think it's really central to understanding some of this, some of what I'm going to be talking about. I think property is fascinating because in many ways it's an embodiment of how humans relate to the world. The ownership model of property that our legal systems and I think many of our ways of understanding the world are entrenched in a worldview that understands people and land and bodies to be ontologically distinct rather than a set of relations of interdependence. So when we talk about property theory or accounts of ownership that guide a lot of Western thought, we often go back to John Locke, whose account of property relies on the creation story recounted in Genesis to explain that property is created when humans invest their labor in land through cultivation and improvement. And this position of domination not only enables the creation of property, but also obligates man to, quote, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground, as we're instructed in Genesis. And this kind of possessive individualism relies on the assumption that individuals own their bodies and the labor which they invest in land. And laboring to create property is not just a right, but also a duty of responsible individuals. But under settler colonialism and racial capitalism, racial hierarchies and racial regimes of property determine that not everyone is accorded these same rights of ownership. And I think the way that homelessness is often discussed reflects this set of assumptions. Homelessness has often been characterized as a lack of property rights. Some scholars even say that without property rights, everyone would be homeless, that it's a key way of protecting the individual against incursion from others. Scholars of settler colonialism help us to trouble some of these assumptions. So Robert Nichols observes that under settler colonialism, the creation of property is recursive, that theft is the mechanism and means by which property is generated, or as he puts it, theft is property. So in other words, the theft of property from Indigenous peoples is justified by settler colonial legal frameworks, which also at the same time create and impose this property regime. So the laws are being created in order to create a just theft. At the same time, they are also creating the thing which is being stolen. So that's why he says theft is property. And these same laws that create property also define personhood and the rights that might be accorded to individuals. And so settler colonialism and racial capitalism deny the personhood of racialized people, withdrawing all the rights that go along with this. Ananya Roy refers to this as banishment, or the dispossession of personhood, which underpins racial capitalism. So the process of criminalizing homelessness not only destroys the very right of people experiencing homelessness to exist in urban space, it denies their personhood and excludes people experiencing homelessness from the category of the human or the public. I think a lot of these assumptions about property are reflected in the laws of trespass, which is one of the core mechanisms that the City of Toronto and many other cities use to regulate parks. So trespass is fundamentally an infringement on laws of private property. It functions, and when it's applied to parks, it functions by defining a space, a patch of land, which is the property of the city, and a set of users and land uses which are permitted to be in this space. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because the laws of trespass become really important, especially during the times of the pandemic. So the vulnerability of people who were already precariously housed and economically marginalized was further compounded as a result of COVID-19. In Toronto, about 60% of all people experiencing homelessness are members of racialized groups, including about 31% of people identifying as Black. And despite comprising only 3% of the total population, Indigenous peoples account for 15% of people experiencing homelessness. And if we look just at the population of people who are staying outdoors, this is a much larger proportion of the population. So it's a larger proportion of people who are racialized, staying outdoors, and about a quarter of those people who are living outdoors are Indigenous. And during the pandemic, the threat of serious illness as a result of COVID-19 added to the precarity that many people were already facing. Shelter use increased by 26% in the wake of emergency pandemic orders, the shutdowns that came along with that. But using the shelters themselves also came along with serious health risks. If we look at the statistics on COVID outbreaks in the shelter system, moving into a shelter, seeking shelter within the shelter system was almost a guarantee of contracting COVID without the possibility of physical distancing or access to PPE. So as a consequence, a lot of people started staying outdoors, and the number of people staying outdoors in Toronto increased by almost 40% following emergency shutdown orders in 2019. And so we saw, like in many cities, the creation of encampments. So there's about just over 50 encampments that were created in the city, with about 3 large encampments in the city's downtown core that accounted for most of the population living in encampments. And I can say, someone who living in Toronto, who heard kind of the public discourse and heard what people were saying about these encampments, I think there was initially kind of an understanding, but this very quickly turned into people being concerned about things like trash, violence, drug use, and criminal activity happening within these encampments. And without access to running water, concerns about sanitation and fire allowed all of this to be kind of encased within a discourse about concerns for safety. So one of the things you'll see when all the politicians are talking about encampments is like, this isn't safe, this isn't healthy, we're doing this to protect the people who are living within these encampments. Toronto City bylaws expressly prohibit camping or setting up tents in parks. So I think people who were living in encampments saw the writing on the wall, and there was a very quick mobilization to apply for a court injunction in hopes that they could suspend the enforcement of city anti-camping bylaws for the duration of the pandemic and for the emergency orders. This went to court in 2020, and the coalition was fighting to stay in the parks lost, and the judge ruled that parks are public resources. They are intended to be used and available by everyone. The encampments impair the use of the parks by others. And I'm going to read you a little part of that decision. Quote, it is an unfortunate reality that many homeless people live in city parks even when there is not a pandemic, but the city must have the tools to address situation where public health and safety is jeopardized and where it limits or prevents the use of parks by the public. And he goes on to explain that the parks must be cleared. So he says, this causes me to find that the balance of inconvenience favors the city and the public interest, ensuring that the parks are a common resource available to everyone, which is the purpose of the anti-camping bylaw. And through this decision, people experiencing homelessness are essentially banished from the category of the public, right, through this argument that says, we have to protect this for the public. We need to preserve the use of public space for the people for whom it is intended. So I'm kind of skipping over quite a bit of legal wrangling and arguing that went on just to kind of paint the overall picture of what happened in Toronto. The consequence of the decision I just talked about was that it paved the way for the city to engage in a coordinated action to clear the parks of all the encampments. In June 2021, Toronto City Council adopted a set of measures in response to COVID-19. And specifically, it adopted what it called a goal of zero encampments by passing a zero encampment resolution. And this zero encampment resolution paved the way for the city to enact plans that had been brewing for months. So on June 22nd, police on horses and in riot gear, as well as 100 private security guards, arrived at the three main encampments. They gave residents 2 hours to collect their belongings, and they were given either the option of taking shelter in one of the city's designated shelter sites, and those who did not leave were arrested. And this was at a cost of about $2 million, right? So significant resources being invested in clearing people from the parks and, remediating the park spaces. One city spokesperson explained, quote, the city's response to encampments takes into consideration the health and well-being of those living outside and broader community needs. The city cannot force people to come inside and avail themselves of the many services offered by the city, but living in an encampment in a city park is unhealthy and illegal. And so again, they're stressing the unhealthiness, right, which the sleeping outside is causing, and marrying this with another discourse about responsibility, like it's your responsibility to go inside and receive services and stop living in the park. These encampment clearances were violent. The city viewed these as simply the rightful enforcement of a bylaw, but for many people it carried with them the same trauma as being evicted from home and from community. And many people living in parks are survivors of trauma of one form or another, and this eviction magnified the experiences that had led to them living in the park in the first place. And one person evicted from the park on June 22nd explained, his name is Brian Cherry, and this was published in a book of writings primarily by people living in these encampments or people serving them. And he says, "I'm still processing the trauma of being with my friends as police in riot gear brutally pushed and beat them out of the 3 parks where they were living peacefully. I live my life surrounded by other unhoused folks who, like me, are still living with trauma every day." So he's comparing this trauma to other things that he's experiencing. One of the things that I find most troubling and perhaps ironic about these park clearances that took place is because they took place against a very powerful discourse of reconciliation which has emerged in Canada over the past 15 years. Reconciliation with Indigenous people has come to serve as a really important framing device for discussing public policy. Reconciliation is a term that's entered broad public discourse in Canada following the conclusion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. This is a commission that was established in response to a class action lawsuit launched against the federal government by survivors of the residential school system, very similar to the boarding school system in the U.S. And the commission found that this school system, which operated for over 200 years, was a clear case of cultural genocide and outlined a list of 94 calls to action designed to ameliorate the consequences of this system and contribute to reconciliation. And I think it's important to note that many of the Indigenous peoples who are living in parks have direct linkages to the trauma of the school system. And this is something that Indigenous scholars working in this space of reconciliation and trauma often note. Reconciliation, I think it sounds great, it's very hopeful, and the term suggests a desire to achieve a post-colonial state of affairs. However, it's often used in ways that actually serve to obfuscate ongoing processes of colonialism and assimilation. It's a discourse that makes post-coloniality possible by purporting to reckon with the injustices suffered by Indigenous peoples without addressing the material requirements of decolonization. And as Mushkegowuk scholar Michelle Daigle notes, if processes of dispossession and assimilation are not addressed and resourced and are not redressed, this discourse of reconciliation remains merely performative. So this clearance of the parks in this context seems ironic to me in the wake of policies by the City of Toronto, their beautiful reconciliation action plan. And I think anyone who's a planner will have a sense of what this document contains. It's 10-step approach to achieving reconciliation. And one of the commitments that they made in this plan was by making changes to the ways that parks are managed. Specifically, and this happened very recently, this is just in October 2022, so 5 months ago, the city announced that they would open 3 designated sites in Toronto parks for Indigenous people to hold sacred fire ceremonies. And it was something that they had committed to in this action plan. And I want to say, I think that's a great first step, right? Figuring out how Indigenous peoples can make this kind of space in the city is important. But it's also ironic in the sense that it's very clearly and very narrowly defining what might constitute indigeneity, who would count as being able to use this space, and under what conditions, right? The permitting of this system is very narrow. It allows fires only to be run by agencies or groups that are vetted by the city according to guidelines set by the city in spaces specially designated by the city. And ultimately, the regulations are very prescriptive and restrictive in terms of how they make fires possible. When this first was announced, I saw this as potentially a very positive initiative. Last week, the program was suspended, and I live very close to one of the sites where sacred fires have been permitted. And I noticed that they have been running almost continuously since this was announced. So there's 2 teepees with fires burning that have been burning continuously since this initiative started. And when I noticed that happening, I was thinking, like, this is probably not what the city had in mind when they started this, right? So this is a park that has, was not subject to the clearances. So there are about 15 tents in this park, and it's clear that people are going to warm up in these sacred fire sites that are being run by a local Indigenous employment agency. And it's clearly something that is helping these people to survive. I'd like to do further research to kind of understand the implications of this. But it seemed like it was potentially subverting the intent, right? I can kind of imagine the city saying, like, well, you can have a fire and it'll be from 3 to 5 on Saturday, and that's kind of what they envisioned. And what happened was the fires are constantly burning, which I have a suspicion this might have something to do with the program being suspended. Yet to be determined. So I guess this leaves us, I've outlined this problem. It kind of leaves me, or might leave you with this question of, like, well, what to do? Like, what is it that you want to see happening? And a lot of the research that I do focuses on problems, and I think that's probably common for a lot of people working in the social sciences, right? Progressive social science research is trying to solve all sorts of social problems, social and political problems. And I find this, as someone who's been doing research for a while now, this can often be really draining, right? Really tiring, constantly confronted with problems. And it's something that I think there's some scholars have pointed out. When we focus on the damage, this is Eve Tuck's work on suspending damage. She says, when we focus on the damage, this has the effect of pathologizing communities. When we focus on the damage, that's often all that there is. Similarly, reflecting on the ways that Black suffering is often positioned in urban analyses, Black studies scholar Catherine McKittrick warns that, quote, analyses of racial violence are stalled by a paradoxical preoccupation with the suffering or violated Black body and the stubborn denial of Black sense of place. And I think what she's saying, or what I understand her to be saying, is that tracing the dimensions of racist violence alone cannot constitute a liberatory politics. And instead, what McKittrick argues, that an analytics of race should be based not on suffering but on human life. And so following McKittrick, I suggest that a liberatory or anti-colonial politics must be grounded in a foremost concern with creating the conditions for the proliferation of life. So what does this mean? And what does this look like? Or what might this look like in this context that I've been talking about? I think that the Indigenous histories and relations to territory of this place that I've been talking about actually offer a lot in terms of thinking about problems of houselessness and injustice in important ways. So Toronto is within the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas, and Anishinaabeg. And these are territories that overlap. And people have created ways of negotiating the terms under which this territory might be shared, and how people might coexist. So the treaty that I'm talking about or the agreement I'm talking about is called the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and it's a pre-colonial treaty between the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee. It's designed to promote peaceful coexistence between sovereign nations and reflects the kind of principles that are required in order for people to maintain both diplomatic relations with each other as well as environmental relations, so to ensure mutual survival. And this treaty outlines how these territories are to be shared for mutual benefit and survival. And like many other Indigenous diplomatic agreements, the meaning of this agreement is captured in both oral traditions and symbolized in wampum belt, which you see here. And the meaning of the belt and the meaning of the treaty is captured by the symbolism of this bowl, which you see in the middle, a bowl of food being shared around a circle, right? The dish symbolizes the common hunting ground and shared environment of the territory, and the spoon, which you don't see here, symbolizes the necessity of sharing the territory. And understanding that survival requires those sharing the territory must limit the resources they take in order to leave enough for others and in order to ensure mutual survival. Some people might see this as merely a historical relic, but Anishinaabe people have been, I think, quite consistent in advocating for its applicability today. And I'm thinking particularly about the ways this treaty has been highlighted by Ogima Mikina, which is an artist collective started by Susan Blight and Hayden King. One of the things that they've done is create these billboards that depict the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And so here you see this in downtown Toronto. And they've depicted the Dish with One Spoon wampum and the words Gishpin Wanda, Kendama Wengego, Abiden, Natam Gigwajikandam Manda. And they've printed these words very largely, and the translation is small if you look at it carefully, and I think that's intentional. And translated from Anishinaabe these words mean, if you want to learn something, first you must learn this. And they explain, this treaty imagines that we as diverse people and nations can live together peacefully in the same territory if we respect rights to mutual autonomy. But more, we have obligations of mutual care to each other and to the land we share. If we are serious about moving forward together in a good way, we must collectively relearn these obligations. We must start at the beginning. This agreement should be understood in as part of a longer diplomatic tradition and as a reflection of Indigenous legal orders. Gitscan scholar Val Napoleon makes a distinction between a legal system, which describes a state-centered legal system in which law is managed by legal professionals and in legal institutions, and legal orders, which describe law that is embedded in non-state political, economic, and spiritual institutions, or in other ways, how we negotiate our interactions every day in various ways, not all of which are codified or state-sanctioned. And Leanne Simpson explains that our legal system isn't a series of laws based on authoritarian power and punishments for when the laws are broken. It is an embedded, interwoven, spiritual, emotional, and social system of intelligence that fosters independence, community, and self-determination. So I think that this offers us some really interesting ways of thinking about relations to each other, relations to land, and mutual responsibilities to ensure survival. I find it interesting, however, or sad, that in spite of all of this talk of reconciliation, this is not something, the dish with one spoon is not something recognized by Canada generally, or the city of Toronto. I had a student doing some research talking about, could this be a basis for environmental planning in Toronto? And the response they got from the staff member they were talking with is that we don't recognize this, essentially. The only treaty we recognize is the Government of Canada, Treaty 13, with the Mississaugas of the Credit, right? We don't recognize these agreements that were not made with Canada in pre-colonial times. So they explained, while the dish with one spoon might have important principles and guidelines, the city really has no legal obligation to implement them. But I think it offers us important guidance regarding our responsibilities and obligations for people living in Toronto, and specifically how reconciliation might be understood or homelessness might be positioned. This is something that Indigenous scholars talk about when they talk about Indigenous experiences of homelessness, which they see not as something resulting from a lack of structure or a lack of recourse to property rights, but something that needs to be understood as a composite loss, right? Disconnection from families and communities, disconnection and isolation from relations to land, water, place, family, kin, animals, cultures, languages, and identity. And they show us that homelessness is something that cannot culturally, spiritually, emotionally, or physically be addressed without also addressing many of these different types of loss, which are also, fundamentally, I think, things that have something to tell us about reconciliation, right? If we are trying to address the harms of the past, this is these contain actions, right, that could be taken. So I want to conclude by talking a little bit about how this might also figure into a discussion about environmental justice, and specifically Indigenous environmental justice. So I began by talking about accounts of property that focus on the agency of humans and their assumed position of domination in relation to the more than human world. And I think in this sense, private property also contains a set of ecological principles in addition to a set of social and political assumptions. These prevailing ecological relations, it is assumed, are relations of domination and control. And I think this set of assumptions is reflected in the frameworks that govern and manage parks. Indigenous ontologies invert this relationship between land and body are understood to be ontologically linked. Drawing on the Anishinaabe creation story, Vanessa Watts explains that within an Anishinaabe cosmology, land is alive and thinking. And so humans derive their agency possessed by land and more than human kin. And humans rely on these relationships for survival. And consequently, human agency is understood as the agency already possessed by creation, or as an extension of that agency. And this relational understanding of human agency gives rise to a dense set of relationships, obligations, and duties to place that form the basis of Indigenous legal orders, which have the flourishing of life as their core aim. And the practices that maintain these relations and enable the flourishing life is at the cornerstone of Anishinaabe concepts of law and justice. Working within this framework, Anishinaabe scholar Deborah McGregor describes environmental justice as the equitable distribution of environmental burdens and benefits across racial, ethnic, and economic groups. And she articulates an Anishinaabe understanding of environmental justice that includes duties and responsibilities to all beings and people, or Minabimatsuin, which translates as living well in the world, or a good life. It's a holistic concept that involves living in respectful and reciprocal terms with all creations. And it requires paying attention to and restoring relations upon which life depends and which might be currently lacking. Right? So it's a call to pay attention and to care for the relations that life relies upon. At the end of a talk like this, I usually get a set of questions like, well, is this even possible? Or is the thing you're talking about, just a pipe dream? Can people act in dramatic ways to address these problems that we're talking about? And I want to say, yes, governments take dramatic action in order to address housing problems. In fact, the government of Ontario very recently committed to building a lot of new housing under its so-called More Homes Built Faster Act, passed in 2022. However, this is committing to building housing not for the unhoused, but for the wealthy. But they've taken dramatic steps. They've set aside environmental legislation in order to permit new single-family housing in Ontario's Greenbelt, so land that was set aside for environmental protection. And this is being touted as a way of getting the economy moving again and addressing the harms caused by the pandemic. But it will see housing built in ecologically sensitive and agriculturally significant lands, and will not ultimately serve the houseless. So it is possible. It is possible to house people. I think what we need are different ways of thinking about how that might be done and the ethics that might guide those processes. And I think Indigenous ontologies are perhaps one way that we might identify some of those alternatives. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Miriam Solis. I'm located in the Community and Regional Planning Program here at UT Austin in the School of Architecture. And I would like to thank Dr. Kahns for the opportunity to participate today. When I got that email, I knew I'd be starstruck, and we can all see why. Is the interventions that Dr. Dorries is making in the urban planning field are quite spectacular. And I think that, and I can actually tell so many of us here are from very applied fields, working within a prescribed set of rules. And we get to engage this critical social theory to think about how we want to transform those rules in organizational environments that we're embedded in. So I'm very happy to be here, and my job is to jumpstart the conversation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing other folks' questions and thoughts. I thought I'd start with 3 questions and reflections to get us going. 2 of them pertain to this case in particular, and the third is about Dr. Dorries' work in the urban planning field more generally. So one of the things that struck me about the reconciliation plan is it sounds like it's a national effort being adopted locally, and a resistance from formal or institutional actors to engage in deeper conversations about what this might mean in a practical sense, or in what the material redistribution might look like. So as a planner, and this is because I think that a lot of us students And instructors might be inclined to say, well, they sound like really terrible planners, right? They didn't use the community engagement tools that we're all learning in our graduate programs. They didn't engage community in defining the terms and setting the terms. And so my question is, to what degree is that a thing? In this particular case, could these urban planners could have been more proactive in engaging community and working with Indigenous communities to set forth a better reconciliation plan that actually engaged in anti-colonial practice. And as a bit of context, in urban planning, we talk a lot about how to work with communities, and admittedly, we don't do as good a job as we should, but it's a big part of graduate school curriculums is how do we work with communities to create plans that better reflect their priorities and commitments. My second question, so I work with youth of color in thinking about climate action, and there's a lot of research showing that young people, and props to Generation Z and those younger than you, young people tend to think of intersectional oppression in a way that previous generations did not. And what we're seeing is that it's not only an analytical framework that they use, but it's actually also how they're doing a lot of the work in terms of acting upon the interconnectedness of problems. So what we're seeing is that youth-led climate activist organizations are doing both gun reform and climate action. And they're taking on a wide range of issues all at the same time. And so what struck me about this case is that to some degree, there is a lot of organizing and advocacy around several of these issues, right? The push for greener spaces, to advance climate action, anti-displacement organizing and advocacy, and anti-racist urban planning practice. And so my question is, what is the role of coalitions and solidarity in Toronto or in other places that you've worked in order to advance this anti-colonial practice? And the third question has to do with something that you've actually pointed out in your writing, which is that there's been an explosion of interest in settler colonialism. So we're seeing scholars and practitioners across a wide range of fields adopt this as a framework. And in urban planning, we're fortunate to have you be one of those persons really leading us in that discussion. But so my question is, what makes you hopeful about that? But also, what are some things that cause you concern or that you may have trepidations about as we see the proliferation of and use of this concept in very formalized and professionalized spaces? So I'll stop there and we'll change roles.
Yeah, thanks for those really great questions. I'm going to address the first one about reconciliation and engagement first. Well, and I hear the question is, will better community engagement produce better plans, right? Which I think is a question that planners are always thinking about and advocating for, right? If we talk to people, they'll tell us what they need and what they want. And I would agree with that. I think the challenge comes down to how well are we listening, right? And how, and I think it gets complicated in a bunch of ways. Like planners become advocates, right? They become people who are communicating to politicians who ultimately have the power to say, we like this and we support this plan that the communities put forward, or no, We don't support it. We're implementing a zero encampment policy. Right, and so there we get onto questions of power, not just communication, right? How well are we listening and communicating, but what kind of power do we have, right? As communities, as planners, as individuals working within constrained frameworks, right? And I think this is something that you could look at in any context, right? We think about this in a planning context or maybe a legal context, and I've had conversations with people today who are telling me about working here in Texas on issues of race or what have you, and telling me like they're working in a, confronted with a particular context. So I think that's always going to be a challenge. I don't think I have a great solution for that, other than to say, you have different tools, different strategies that are going to work in different contexts and at different times. Sometimes community engagement will produce better plans, and sometimes you'll have those great plans that won't go anywhere, right? Because they're not being taken up. One thing that makes me skeptical in this context of talking about reconciliation and plans for reconciliation is, I think, some of the things that I mentioned, right? Canada, I think generally this discussion of reconciliation fits really nicely into a general desire to be nice and to be seen as nice, and reconciliation is one way we can continue to tell ourselves about how nice we are and how good we are, compared to perhaps our neighbors, and I'm skeptical of that, right? Particularly when I see these kinds of things taking place, like we're using great language to talk about things that really aren't great for people. So that's kind of my answer to that question. The other set of questions, I heard as a question about like intersectionality and coalitions and solidarity and what's happening there, and as well as an explosion of interest in settler colonialism in a variety of fields, which I kind of think are a related set of questions. I agree. I think talking to youth, talking to young people who are involved in organizing is incredibly inspiring, because they're doing so much very important work with so much urgency and conviction. It's really inspiring, and I think pushing conversations on intersectionality, which I think is really important for building coalitions and solidarity. I think one of the reasons I'm so attracted to talking about life is because I feel like that it is an expansive concept, right? For talking about common aims and requirements, right? Our requirements for life are fundamentally the same, right? We all require clean water, we all require food, we all require shelter. Like, these are things that are going to be the same in any context. So it's a great starting point for having conversations that might be really difficult. Settler colonialism, yes, there's a lot of interest in this term and this topic in a lot of different fields. And you asked about being hopeful. It makes me hopeful because it is a way of highlighting challenges and problems and injustice. It provides an analytic tool for thinking through some of these challenges in fields sometimes where this has not always been at the forefront, like planning. I mean, I think I began by saying, we like to think we're doing such a great job. It's such a good thing, but along the way, we can also do a lot of damage as planners. Concern, I took that to mean concern about settler colonialism. I mean, I think it runs a danger of being narrowly focused on the experiences and concerns of Indigenous people, And there, I think the attention to intersectionality, intersecting forms of struggle, coalition building, again, can get lost. And there's a number of scholars who've been writing about that. And again, that's why I think life is a useful term for bringing a lot of these concerns together. Like when I'm working with life as kind of framework, I have much less problem integrating scholars from various fields, right? Because life or death is common to everyone. All right, maybe we can open it to. Do you usually do other questions?
We've got lots of
yeah.
time.
Okay.
Heather, if you want to stay at the podium
Okay.
and respond, I can field or Cooper can field or you can field, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the very great presentation. I just had a question about when we're talking about reconciliation steps, was giving land back one of those things, and especially when the Sacred Fire was, they were like, okay, this can go on and everything. Was policing a big part of it? Are the police centered around the area because they think that this is something that because when you were showing the form, it says that you take responsibility, that you take this area clean and everything. So are the police deployed to make sure that those things are happening? Because if they are, then it just turns back on everything, and it's just about policing the indigenous population because you don't think that they're able to uphold their promises, and it wouldn't be the same with if white people were doing anything in a public space. So.
That's a really good question. It's something that will require, I think, some more research for me to understand. It's one of the questions I have in mind. The big enforcement for fires comes not so much from police, which have been deployed to parks in larger numbers since the beginning of the pandemic, but the enforcement comes from the fire office, right, who are putting out fires. And people are starting fires illegally. And so I think your observation that it could lead to more policing and enforcement, I think is really important. Because once you create a rule, like you can create fires under these circumstances, you also create like a mechanism for the enforcement of that. And I think the reconciliation plan is not about land back, right? It's about administration back. It's like creating these kinds of laws or bylaws and policies that make some things easier for Indigenous people, but it's I think the fire policy, and again, this is one of the reasons I was so interested in it, because it was probably the closest thing that had to do with land, right? It was a form of land use that had been really problematic in the past. It was really important for people to have access to, and where there was a lot of existing resistance and public discourse about like dangers of fires in the parks, right? That's something people talked about a lot when they were talking about why encampments are a problem. So there's fires.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and the questions. I was thinking about this idea of Indigenous homelessness, and I think you mean something much bigger than just not having a home. And I wonder if these Indigenous legal traditions being taught now at law schools in Canada, you might have some hope that this will change the next generation of lawyers, and this might look different in 15 or 20 years.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, for those of you who might not be aware, there is a law school in Canada. Actually, I think there's two now. The University of Victoria and McGill University, as part of their law programs, offer programming in Indigenous legal traditions. And in fact, the University of Victoria offers a joint degree program in Canadian law. So you get your JD, and I think they call it Indigenous legal orders. I can't remember the exact letters they use for the degree, but you got 2 degrees. And this legal orders degree is based on a set of courses. You actually are, people spend time on the land, they spend time with communities, not, I think, learning, but I think it's also a kind of collective process with communities of trying to understand collectively what these legal orders are, right, and how they might coexist with Canadian legal laws, right, which is also it's all like is already understood as a binational legal system, right? We have the French canon law existing alongside the common law, so there's already a tradition there of legal systems interacting, and the people who are advocating and part of developing these Indigenous legal orders say, like, we have this framework, we understand ourselves as having a multi-jural system, I'm not sure that's the word, but we have this tradition, Indigenous law can be part of that. And I think that work, which has been taking place over decades, has really changed how lawyers are thinking and the kind of discourse that happens within the legal sphere. Right? And there was recently discussion about a new Supreme Court appointment, and there was a lot of people had hope, and I think there was reasonable hope that an Indigenous legal scholar would be appointed who might bring that perspective to the Supreme Court. They weren't appointed, but I think it was a reasonable possibility. And I think it's a model that other fields who are kind of grappling with these administrative legal frameworks, implementing of law, can look to. And I think there's important possibilities there. I think there's also limits, right? There's still going to be huge limits that come along with working within capitalism, within pursuing a particular set of goals concerning capital accumulation. So, I think it's important to recognize the limits there as well. That was a very long answer, I think, to that question.
I think your comment on how the luxury housing was being built upon a green belt was really interesting and kind of conflicted with this idea of preserving park space and green space. I was curious if you could talk more about sort of maybe economic drivers or financial incentives, why the city's thinking about park space versus nature or kind of cultural roots to these parks and green spaces.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. When I started doing this research and I started looking at this issue, I thought it was going to be a way for me to kind of get at ecological concerns, right? What it means for a park to exist in the city and the kinds of, ecological value that it brings to a city. And what I found was that was actually kind of missing from most of the discussion about parks, and not just the discussion, but how parks are actually being managed, where it kind of doesn't matter what the park looks like. It could be just pavement and called a park, and it would have this set of regulations concerning property and all the things you can't do, right? The ecological question is actually missing. And so the connection there is it's kind of this distant connection. People are using the parks for housing because they have nowhere else to go. And at the same time, we have this drive to build houses. It's actually a bit of a scandal right now because it has been revealed that the developers paid a lot of money for access to the political leaders, all kinds of things that won't, I think, necessarily surprise you. But developers paid for these laws to be bent, and it was politically expedient and lucrative for everyone involved. And that ends up kind of being the like where the ecological comes in. I can't remember your question, actually. It was like,
why is it like how the city's prioritizing like economic benefit of parks versus like
right, right. And so why protect parks? And here we're not talking about environmental protection. We're talking about protecting the amenity value for people living downtown. And maybe something important to understand is that Toronto is a city where the urban core is some of the most expensive, one of the most expensive places to live in the city. Like one of the things that we talk about in Toronto is the suburbanization of poverty. Like the poorest communities, racialized communities, immigrant communities are living on the suburbs, which are not well serviced by public transit or don't have quite the same access to other urban amenities that people living in the core do. The core is really expensive. $1 million condos, multi-million-dollar homes, everything is really tiny. And so protecting the parks in that part of the city is really about protecting the amenity value for those people who are living in that space, right? Who are wealthy, who are voting, who are vocal. Yeah.
Hi, that was really, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think there were huge resonances with Austin, because we just went through, a camping ban, a release of a camping ban, a citywide referendum to reinstate the camping ban in parks and in public spaces. And the question I have, I think, is a follow-up on, Vicky's question. Because I think your talk starts with a consideration of property. And I kind of think, and then in this answer you gave an example of corruption. But I actually don't think it's just corruption that's driving property values. So, and I also don't know how one thinks about scaling up Indigenous reconfigurations of property. And so I'm just thinking, like, because Austin is a little bit like Toronto in the sense that it's booming. Mm. And there are massive housing shortages, and the market has shown itself to be woefully insufficient in meeting people's needs, even though it's meeting it's very lucrative to build expensive housing. And that statue started off, there's been no public housing built in 30 years. So I'm just wanting you to say more about property value, and because I was saying like property taxes are a huge issue in this town, because gentrification is a huge issue. The central core is also becoming much more expensive here, and racialized populations are being pushed into the suburbs where there are no services, because historically the services have been on the Central East Side. So, yeah. I don't know. It's just a desire for more.
Well, you're absolutely right. One of the things is not just corruption driving development. Certainly, property taxes are a huge issue. I mean, property taxes in Toronto are pretty low compared to other places that I've lived in Canada. They should be higher, right? We could do more if we paid more tax. No politician's going to run on a platform of raising property taxes. So what other alternative do you have? Like, build more. If you build more property, you're going to have more income to pay for the things you need to run a city. And that's what's happened in Toronto and in Ontario generally. Like, everyone's eager, every municipality's eager to capture that development property tax dollar. It's also related to why no new public housing has been built. Like we have public housing agencies that actually had pretty large holdings of property in the core. And what has happened is that because they've been defunded, they don't have the money to keep up the properties that they do own. They're selling off land in the core for luxury condos. And displacement is happening that way, right? They're not building back as much public housing as they're destroying. And people have talked about this public land in the core is like the last kind of undeveloped. What do they say? I mean, they're fairly open about it. Like, this is the last bonanza that we have. Like, we're going to develop this public land, and it's the last undeveloped parts of the core, right? It's our last chance to make big money. So that's part of what's driving condominium development, which is also bringing in very different class of people, wealthier, younger, and pushing out, people who can't afford housing. So, I mean, property is kind of everywhere you look. It's a way of thinking about interests. It's a way to understand why certain decisions are being made, why certain policies are being followed. So you're absolutely right. Yeah, I would say. I don't know if that answers your question. Ish, did you have
No, I don't know how to think about property myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Heather, thanks so much. That was a really fantastic talk, and I really like the argument that you're making about sort of thinking past this sort of late liberal notion of reconciliation towards something else. And I was wondering to what extent people who were in houseless encampments themselves were thinking with those notions and deploying them. I mean, you talked about a legal injunction that failed, but I was wondering, like, what other kinds of responses were people who are living in these encampments making to the state? And then I had another quick question about temporality, which is that I noticed that this clearing out of encampments happens during the summer, which is a very nice time for it to happen.
Yeah.
And I wonder, are there different kinds of arguments and possibilities that can be made when this question becomes like a lethal question, like when it arises in the winter as opposed to the summer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was thinking that I was putting all these pictures together, like how few pictures I had of the winter, which is cold. There was still and long. There was still snow on the ground when I left Toronto on yesterday, and I think if there had been encampment clearances in the winter, people would have been much angrier than they were. In June, it's warm out. You don't really think about it. People are at the lake, and it's less of an issue. But of course, we're talking about life and death. You can die very quickly if you're outside in the winter. It's very uncomfortable, and if you're not, your health is really at immediate risk, right? Staying outside for extended periods of time. So it's a very big issue. I think people in the parks are very much aware of these ironies. I mean, you look at the kinds of signs that people have up in the parks. I didn't include any pictures in this presentation, but you see signs that say stolen native land, it's such a large group of Indigenous people who are staying in these parks. They're flying flags that represent Indigenous resistance. I think people who are having this experience are really keenly aware of the connection between what they're experiencing in the park and this longer history of colonialism, right? Because it's been part of public discourse, right? Or it's something that they've personally experienced. I think where we don't see that coming up as much is in the political debates about what to do about the problem of homelessness and its potential relation to reconciliation, right? And because if you did have that conversation, if you started it, it would be really challenging to save face as a politician, right? The ironies of it, the shortcomings of what people are doing, I think becomes quite quickly apparent.
Thanks. So my question centers around the slide that I think was describing the registration form for sacred fires. And I'm curious to know, so you'd mentioned that it seemed like there were maybe 4 primary organizations that were organizing sacred fires in the park, and then 1 organization that was providing labor or day labor services for folks.
It seems to me that the fires are in this park. This is it's called Allen Gardens, and it's in the east downtown core. So it's a poor neighborhood. It's also the location of several Indigenous agencies, so that they have there's a employment agency, there's a women's organization. They tend to be located there. It seems to me that there's one agency that has been doing most of the fire keeping or organizing that.
So at this park, it seems like there's a fairly, at the very least, friendly relationship between the organizations that were organizing the fires and the resident unsheltered population in the park. What about other parks? Were there tensions between organizers of the sacred fires and inhabitants of the parks, or was there a fairly peaceful
the other parks maintain their encampment ban? So I haven't quite figured out why these people are still in this park, because it has always been illegal, and since the encampment clearances, there's been fences put up. It's not physically possible to set up a tent in a lot of the places where people prefer to do that. So I don't know, what those dynamics are like. Those neighborhoods are also much wealthier. They're like the cool, hip areas.
Okay.
$7 latte.
So we say that we need to promote how Indigenous legal orders, the ideas lie there, how they function. Mm-hmm. But when I read the judgment that we quoted, Black et al., I thought that the logic was co-opted in favor of the other class. And I think one of the perils of promoting Indigenous legal orders is that the first thing is that it will be co-opted. Yeah. So have you thought of, or maybe other ideas about countering that danger that lies in,
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think that's always everything. It's Glenn Coulthard, who's a Indigenous political theorist. He wrote a great book called Red Skin, White Masks. He talks about the discourse of reconciliation, of recognition, really. What happens when the state recognizes us, recognizes our demands, and takes up the language that we're using, really, which is not quite how he puts it, but he's talking about what happens when we're finally recognized. And he says, the state, and I think more broadly settler colonialism, has always been really fantastic at co-opting our language and our struggles and turning it against us. This has always happened. And so, this is why I say there are limitations to that. I think it's opening up, talking about Indigenous legal orders, formalizing it, opens up certain possibilities, right? It opens up certain alternative ways of doing things, potentially. But at the same time, you're always going to run the risk that it's being turned against you. just why he says, and there's a lot of people who take a similar position, that we cannot rely on the state to do these things. In fact, we should not focus so much of our attention on making these demands of the state. Yeah, there are demands to be made, but if we aren't doing these things for ourselves, there's nothing to be won. There's no improvements to be made. We need to be speaking our languages. We need to be living our cultures. We need to be living in this way, because the state's not going to do it for us. Right? So, I think this is a tension that exists in many different contexts, right? How much are you going to rely on these frameworks, on these systems that have been harming you? How much are you going to rely on them to not do that, ultimately?
So thank you for your presentation and for your thoughts. My question is also a kind of follow-up to her question, to strengthen the sort of pessimistic side of the story. So you did start your presentation speaking about the regime of private property and what it does, and then you ended your presentation invoking the possibilities that indigenous ontologies may offer. But what I see is that in a way there is a kind of damaged side in terms of a sort of ontological loss for indigeneity under settler capitalist property relations, right? So then, because that 15% of people that were homeless or suffering from homelessness, they also were suffering from landlessness, right?
Yeah.
And that contiguity between homelessness and landlessness as a kind of tragic historical fate of indigenous peoples in Canada and elsewhere, here and there. So what we do about it in terms of that kind of tension and tragedy, in a way?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I fully cut your question. So the door open, there's a lot of noise. But you're asking about the problem of landlessness,
and homelessness, and the continuity of them, and what it does to indigeneity in terms of the deeper ontological loss we have as native peoples.
right?
Because on the one hand, in the previous question, we were speaking about the cooptation of indigenous legal sources. But on this deeper side, that of indigenous ontologies, we have this issue of ontological loss.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it points to the urgency, right, of doing this work, right? If we decide, or if there is, if I'm successful in convincing people that Indigenous ontologies are important and have relevance for planning, for other spheres of work. There is a huge amount of loss. It's not, but it doesn't mean it's gone. We still have people practicing, doing the things that keep these ontologies alive. Right? It's not gone, but I think, like so many other things, we have a new climate report today. Like it's got to happen soon, or that loss will have a serious impact on whether or not we have this choice, right, to do things differently or not. Yeah, I guess I'm more optimistic in the sense that I think, despite the loss, there is still something to be gained. But I recognize that that door might be closing.
Any more questions?